just to confuse you a little more, here's a number 4 carburetor. This is a little Honda carburetor that I showed you the bowl on it, or the float the other day, because this is how floats were for 100 years, or maybe 60. Anyway, same deal, pivot. You want it clean and smooth. But what I want to talk about is float level. On this particular old style float, which is the way most automotive carburetors were in the Holley and Carter AFB and Quadrajet days. In most old car carburetors, the seat was threaded, and there was a washer under there that determined the height of the seat. All this is to get to a point. Edited for time, I hope. So this little guy sits at a certain height when you set him down in there. Same thing with the one with the O-ring and the tab. The seat sits at a certain height as it's intended by the engineer. The needle is a certain length as it's intended by the engineer. That's close enough. Here's an itty bitty little needle. Now this is from the day before the rubber tips. Let's see if I'm lying to you. Yep. That is all metal. Still has the little plunger in the back of it to kind of absorb the shock, but that tip is all metal. If it gets a little bit cruddy, you can sometimes take some very fine sandpaper, and I mean fine, 600 sandpaper, maybe 1,000, 400 at the worst, and put the sandpaper between your fingers and spin the needle on the tip and polish it. And when you're done, if you polish it with some really fine grit paper, you shouldn't be able to see any little wear ring. You shouldn't find anything that you can catch a fingernail on. That's still not the reason I brought this carburetor out. Okay, I dropped the needle down in there. Here's my little float arm. Here's my little pin. What this was all to tell you is, if I built this carburetor to behave at a certain float level, then when I engineer the float and get all the final drawings done, just as the float touches the shock absorber right there, I don't want it standing like this because it's so heavy that it'll compress the shock, but I tilt it over here on its side a little bit, and just as the float touches the shock absorber, which closes the needle, all of this stuff, all of this hardware should be flat and parallel to the parting gasket on the float. That's if it's a carburetor that sits on a motorcycle normal, not an odd V4 carburetor where it's tipped and it's got an odd looking parting line on the float. But most conventional carburetors, when all this stuff is right and the float level is right, and when I talk about float level, you're measuring from this gasket surface here to the top of the float, as I said, just when the little plunger. But the point being, looking at it from the side, all of this arm and the little tab that you bend to control the float level, all of that stuff should be horizontal. That way when the float is pushing on the needle, it's not scrubbing. It's not trying to push the needle to the front or the back of the carburetor. So you can often take a carburetor apart, and if you don't have the float level spec, and it's a horizontal parting line carburetor with a conventional float, you can tell if somebody's been fooling with this little tab and bending it a bunch and changing the float level to way too deep or way too short, because this little arm that holds these guys won't be parallel to the parting surface. When it's done right by the engineer and done right by the mechanic, unless you're changing float level to try to fix a handicap in your metering of your motorcycle, this stuff is typically engineered to be parallel so that you're not putting funny geometry on that needle when you're seating it. So yeah, there's specs. Look up the specs. Get you a pair of calipers and measure from the parting line to the top of the float, just as it's closing. Boom. Okay, so I've got me a number now. That's the distance from the tip to the flat, and as I said, just when this thing is starting to compress the plunger. and use the specs from the factory and rock and roll. But when you see everything at funny angles, that's a sign somebody's been fooling with it. Okay, a while back I drew a little curve showing things about air correction circuits, and it's part of the story. The story went like this, that if you just have a main jet sitting down in fuel in your carburetor, and it goes up there to the venturi, we could draw a venturi here, I suppose. And that you could play with these air correction circuits, and you could get a little bit more linear curve. In other words, I've got this amount of airflow right here. I double the airflow, and my fuel flow doubled. And that's all nice. But it only works over a certain range. It's never a perfectly straight curve. And there are points where the main jet won't pull any fuel. There's just not enough air going across to the top of the main jet, and you're at idle and you're using those circuits. And there are points where no matter what you do with the air correction circuit, you can't get enough fuel out of a certain venturi and a certain nozzle system for the main. Well, the reason to say that is well, that's where 4-barrel carburetors came from on hot rods, is trying to get a fuel curve that's linear and economical when you're going slow, and then when you're going fast, it gets enough fuel for an engine. The difference between part throttle putting on a motorcycle or a car and getting after it and going fast and racing is, 25 or 30 to 1 in terms of how much air is going through that engine, maybe 50 to 1. Okay, so you can't really get there from here just using a jet. You can get close, but usually you have to play some little games. Most cars and motorcycles that have a fairly complex carburetor also rely on metering rods. And on a motorcycle, we just call it the needle. That's the needle. And on this flat slide, same deal. Here's the needle. This is what we call often the nozzle, the emulsion tube or the emulsion nozzle. On the bottom of it is the main jet. Main jet screws into the carburetor down here. This nozzle gets air, the air bleed that we're talking about, the air correction air, comes in and it surrounds this nozzle and runs through these tiny little holes. Okay, so that's nice, but at part throttle versus wide open throttle, it's hard to get that curve just with nothing but an air bleed. You also have to attenuate the flow, that's a nice word, reduce the flow at low throttle settings, or it's easiest, this is the easiest way I know to do it, and that's the way everybody else is doing it, by using a tapered needle. So I drop the slide down, I got less air. The needle's fatter, and the needle restricts the main jet to where the main jet can't flow as much. I still have an air bleed, and I can still bend the curve with my air bleed, but I can also bend the curve, depending on where I am with the throttle, by how fat this needle is. And it's an extraordinary piece of machining because it tapers. It has several bumps in it. It is actually not just a straight taper as I've drawn it right here. So anyway, here's a nozzle. Those are the little air bleeds in the side of the nozzle, and you want to make sure they're clear when you got the carburetor apart. You got to get this thing out without damaging it, which is a little tricky. It's usually held in place by the threads at the bottom of it on the main jet, and it usually comes up through the middle of the carburetor, and you got to get it out without damaging it. And then you got to make sure all these little tiny holes, these little airways for the nozzle, are clear. And there's a couple of different ways that this slide and this needle get yanked up. On the simpler carburetors, it's the throttle. You twist the throttle, the cable pulls this thing up, you got wide open throttle, the needle comes up, I need more fuel. When the needle's all the way up, the main jet, when the throttle's all the way up, this thing, the size of that hole, play CAD guy here for a minute, the size of that hole, the main jet, dictates how much fuel I'm getting at wide open. Because this needle is up and it's out of the way. It's up here somewhere. Or it's down in the hole but not enough to cause any problems.
2 hours later.
when I drop the throttle to part throttle, you can take the main jet out of some carburetors and ride around at half throttle and not know it, because the distance between the nozzle, or I think this is called the needle jet, this diameter up here at the top of the emulsion tube. The difference between that diameter and that needle is what's controlling the fuel when I'm on the main circuit, but I'm not at wide open. I roll it back part throttle, this drops down in, and so that's where you can enrich in the engine, and you can make it leaner at part throttle by raising the needle. It's usually got little clips on it. Let's see if this one does. Yep. It's got a little clip on it, and you move this little E-clip. Another really great reason, oh, that one's so loose it fell off, that's bad. But you move this little clip back and forth on the needle and you change its height, so at part throttle, when I'm not wide open on the main jet and I'm not down on the idle circuits, I can make it slightly richer, slightly leaner. So this story, more airflow, more fuel, I play with this air bleed and I can bend the curve, is true, but it's only over a limited range of airflow changes. And the engine that you've got on your motorcycle, the airflow at idle versus the airflow while it's making 130 horsepower, is a huge change, and the carburetor has to have added complexity to deal with that. It's not just, idle circuit and main jet, it's main jet at cruise at 40, 50 miles an hour and main jet at wide open throttle. It's awfully hard to tune it with just air bleeds, and that's where 4-barrel carburetors came from, because it's very hard to make a simple carburetor on a car engine that's making 500 horsepower do what you want it to do when it's only making 20 or 50 horsepower, and do what you want at 500 horsepower with the same little 2-barrel carburetor. It's just about impossible. So they introduced a secondary carburetor. The other half of the carburetor is dormant when you're cruising around. You hit it and it opens both barrels, and that allows you enough leeway to tune it with air correction circuits.